This is why Jesus still matters. He matters because whatever it is you think matters as an atheist, well, that's because of Jesus.
I've had these conversations with people before where I talk about how you can actually prove the existence, death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus without even using the four Gospels, which the four Gospels are more provable and accurate than so many other documents. And you talk about that in other books, and we've had that on podcasts before. But give me, let's say you're called to testify, and you get three pieces of evidence. This is why I believe Jesus not only existed, but died, buried, resurrected. Here's why I believe it. These three pieces of evidence and why I place my faith in it. And you can't use the New Testament. What do you go with?
Well, okay. So first of all, we all both agree that everything I'm pointing to in the fallout of history are people who had access to a New Testament and simply repeated the claims of the New Testament.
Yes.
But here's what I would say. I would say, look, you cannot find another fictional character in the history of fictional characters who's had this kind of impact on humanity: art, literature, music, education, science, and world religions. You will not find one. And since you cannot find one, it's a reasonable inference that Jesus is something more than a fictional character. So there's something about this impact that speaks to the historicity of Jesus. But you also will not find another mortal living human in the history of humans who's had this kind of impact. I looked at all of them. You look at all the people in the first century. Ask yourself, who in the first century has had the kind of impact of Jesus? These are world leaders. Nero had no impact on the history we live today, but Jesus did. You won't find another deity or religious figure. You won't find another person who claimed to be the Jewish Messiah. You won't find another world leader in the history of world leaders who's had this kind of impact on those five most important aspects of human culture. So if you can't find another human living, human mortal, there's a good reason, a good inference is that he's something other than a living human mortal. In other words, it's not just that this kind of impact is unique enough to demonstrate his historicity. It also speaks to his deity, because it turns out if he is who he said he would. Now think about who he is. Okay, he's a nobody. He doesn't come of royal lineage, doesn't have wealthy parents. He's not born in an important city, a nowhere town. Then he's raised in another nowhere town. Never travels more than about 200 miles to do his entire ministry. He only has 3 years to get that done. Not only that, he has no power, no money. He has no prestigious education. He has no family that can support him, or wife or children that can extend his legacy. He never wrote a book, never wrote a play, never led an army, never led a nation. He was nobody of significance at all. And the people who were actually in power, they were hunting him. The religious people were rejecting him. His own family members, his own disciples were betraying him, were leaving him, were denying him. Then he's falsely accused, brutally executed, and they have to borrow a grave to bury him. Okay, this is the most unlikely person to even have regional influence in the first century, let alone global influence for the next 2,000 years. There's something about Jesus that's different. And you got to ask the question, well, why? Okay, it's not his teaching. I mean, his teaching is fantastic. It's exceptional. It's divine. But you can probably on the pages of other, Buddha and Confucius, you can find similar principles being taught. So it's not that. It wasn't his stature. He's not even unique culturally, socially, ethnically, nothing. But one thing is unique about him that nobody else can say is he rose from the grave. And interestingly, he has unique, unparalleled influence, and he possesses the one unique attribute. And it's nothing to do with this. It's all about the resurrection. It's the only thing that separates him. And it separates a person who is clearly separated from everyone else. So I think it's reasonable for us to say, okay, so that's why this makes, in other words, if you said to yourself, okay, which of these three scenarios makes sense? He is just a fictional character that someone drummed up and really was popular. That explains all this. Or you say, oh no, he's just a kind of a wise ancient sage in the first century. That explains all of this. There's a lot better known wise sages from the first, century and before. Or he is the man who rose from the grave, who claimed to be God, had the authority of God, and then demonstrated his deity with the resurrection. Okay, which of those three options leads to where we are today in terms of influence? It seems to me of those three options, option 3 is a better explanation for what we have. So if I didn't know anything about what the scriptures say about Jesus, but I understood the impact he had, I mean, what cracks me up is we go to these universities and these institutions, and I went to UCLA, and I got my master's there in architecture. And, we think about these universities as a place where just they're the antithesis of faith. They're antithesis of religious worldview, but they're utterly dependent. Remember, the first three modern universities, as we know them today, are Bologna, Paris, and Oxford. Those were founded by Christians. They came right out of the cathedral and monastery systems and the cathedral schools that eventually gave birth to those. And those three Christian universities then gave birth to 24 daughter universities. And from those 24 daughter universities came the scientists and what atheists called the scientific revolution. Well, that revolution was entirely, well, with a few exceptions, Christian. And so I think in the end, the better explanation for all of this, and it's funny how we go to these universities now that deny Jesus altogether, but they were utterly dependent upon Jesus. That was in their charter, and that was on their buildings when they first started. Their mission statement was to advance the name of Jesus, even though today they are denying the name of Jesus. So I think it's important for us to see. That's why if you aren't careful, if we don't write books like this, no one's going to know, because I don't think anyone's teaching our kids.
Right.
I don't think we're going to be able to go, even I don't see a lot of homeschool curriculum that would help you kind of mine out the evidence for Jesus in these little disparate areas. So I think that's why it's important for us this is why Jesus still matters. He matters because whatever it is you think matters as an atheist, well, that's because of Jesus. So he still matters because those things matter to you. And even though you had no idea they were connected to Jesus, they are.